Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
Welcome to Mortification of Spin. My name's Carl Trueman, Professor of Biblical and Religious Studies at Grove City College in beautiful Western Pennsylvania. And I'm here as always with my fellow host and good friend, the Reverend Todd Pruitt, pastor of Covenant Presbyterian Church, Harrisonburg in the beautiful Shenandoah Valley in Virginia. Good to be with you, Todd.
Good to be with you, Carl. We have come to the end of hours of grueling recording, but we do this for the people. We do this for the fans. We know that
we certainly don't do it for the money.
We do not do it for the money. Some of you out there are thinking, "Gosh, it's a podcast. They've been doing this for a long time. They're well established in the podcast community." One of the groundbreaking grandfather of the Christian podcasts. Those guys must make a lot of money.
No, it barely covers the cost of our Bond villain yacht on which we're recording in the Bahamas at the moment.
That's right.
Barely covers the cost of the crew.
I will put it this way. What we make doing Mortification of Spin would not fully cover my coffee bill for an entire month. So there you have it, folks. But see, I bring all that out to just highlight our commitment to the fans. The people need us. And if we weren't there to tell them what to think, I shudder to think about the possibilities.
Yeah, I don't know what Terry Johnson would do with his week if Terry was not tuning in and finding something to criticize and email me about. I think his life would lack all meaning and direction.
I'm quite sure of that. I'm sure that he is waiting in Savannah week after week.
Oh, we're going to hear about that. We'll hear about that, I'm sure, within 24 hours of this dropping. Anyway, well, Todd, we haven't got a guest this week.
No.
But we thought what we'd do is discuss a pastoral problem that has popped up a number of times. People email in with pastoral questions, which we're typically remarkably ill-qualified to answer because, of course, every pastoral question usually has a unique circumstance to it. That means giving direct pastoral advice is difficult. But one problem comes up again and again and again. I think any pastor out there, any elder, any member of a church with Christian friends has probably come across that. And that's, how do good Christian people handle the problem of children who have walked away from the faith? How do they handle the problem of, if we might put it really bluntly, the apparent apostasy of children? And we all know that parenting is, it's not an exact science. Mm-hmm. You can have two sets of parents who bring up their kids in exactly the same way. And the one family will see terrible trouble with their children. The other family, everything just falls perfectly into place. Most of us, I suspect, fall somewhere between those two extremes on the whole. Yeah. But the question of children walking away from the faith, that's a heart-wrenching one, and it's a difficult one. And so I just want to talk today about how one might think about that, or what strategies might one adopt relative to that. So, Todd, I'm guessing that as a full-time pastor, this is something that is a regular part of the diet of pastoral problems that bubble up in your congregation.
Yeah. I have routine conversations about this subject, and of course, it's one that is deeply felt by people. When you're talking about our children, you're talking about something that is incredibly close to our heart. We love our kids. We sacrifice for them. We would withhold nothing from them that is for their good. And so when we see a child that walks away from the Lord or falls into patterns of sin, it's deeply heartbreaking, but there's also a lot of complexity to it. And particularly, I think, if you're a Reformed Christian, there's a doctrinal complexity to it, one that's necessary and one that actually is very comforting, but there's a little bit of complexity. And what I mean by that is, in in my previous theological life, when this would come up, you would just often kind of, though it would be acknowledged as a very sad thing, oftentimes there would be a shrug of, but free will, people just, free will. Well, it's not quite that simple, biblically, and for us who are Reformed, because we have this category of we have a category of covenant, and we also have a category for apostasy. Covenant being something that's very comforting to us, and what I mean by that is that we proceed with the presumption, and not that we proceed with the expectation that our children ultimately will walk with the Lord. That God, by bringing them into a believing family, has been proactively gracious to them, and so we have an expectation that they will walk with the Lord. That said, we also do believe in that biblical category of apostasy, where there are those who are within the covenant community. They've, to use the words of the writer of Hebrews, they've tasted of the heavenly gift. They've received so many of the blessings of being in the covenant community. They've received the sign of the covenant, and then they walk away from the faith. And that's what I mean by a level of complexity, because if you have this strong, robust covenant theology, it makes the apostasy of a child sometimes, in some ways, even more grueling in the dismay that it causes you, because out of that, you cry out of, God, this was a covenant child. This was a child, you lean on Peter's words at his sermon in Pentecost. You have these places to go in Scripture that make it feel like an even deeper tearing away when Reformed Christians see their children depart from the faith. And it's terribly painful, not only to see the child walk away, but then the added complexity of the parent saying, what did I do? What did I do to drive my kid, or what did I not do well enough? And those are the hard ones too. Those are the hard questions to navigate when you have a parent looking at you and saying, I must be a bad parent. I must have failed. Those are the hard ones to navigate.
Yeah. And I think in that context, it's very useful to, if I can say, lower the bar. Mm-hmm. One thing I think we need to realize as parents is we cannot change a child's heart. Mm-hmm. Conversion is a spiritual thing. Walking with the Lord is a spiritual thing. We have the means of grace at our disposal.
Right.
What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, primarily regular church going. I think it's very important that parents teach their kids that being in church on a Sunday, that's the most important thing they do during the week. I've quoted him in the past relative to Roman Catholicism, but I remember Archbishop Chaput in Philadelphia, when asked at a lecture I was at, was asked by somebody about the falling away of young people from the church. Without taking a breath, he said, well, the big problem is that your generation, my generation, didn't teach our kids that church was important.
Yeah.
He said, you take your kid to a ball game on a Sunday instead of going to church, you are sending the unequivocal message that ball games are more important than church. Right. So I think we can make sure that our kids have a vision of the importance of church. We can read the Bible with them. We can catechize them. We can pray for them, or we can pray with them. In a sense, though, there's not much more than that we can do.
Right.
And one of the things that I would always try to say to parents who are struggling with a child that's fallen away is, did you do all that you were supposed to do? Mm-hmm. Did you do the basics? And if you did the basics, then as heartbreaking as this situation is, you can at least sleep at night knowing that nothing you did drove them down this path. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important thing for people to grasp, to realize that if somebody apostatizes, having had all of the right things in place, it's ultimately their responsibility and not yours. Now, that doesn't make the pain any less in some ways, but hopefully it lifts some of the guilt off the shoulders of the parents. Yeah. I think guilt can be a terribly burdensome and heartbreaking thing, and we can do something to lift the guilt off the parents by reminding them of, everybody makes choices for themselves at the end. The key thing is, Did you teach them church was important? Did you teach them the gospel?
Yeah.
Did you pray with them and for them?
Mhm.
If you did those things, then you did all you could. You
Right.
did all you could. And
Yeah.
whatever else you feel, you mustn't feel guilty at this point.
Yeah. And I add to that, so long as you were not a ragingly appalling hypocrite,
Yeah.
and again, no kid I've ever talked to has expected their parent to be sin-free. I've
No.
never met a kid that expected their parent to be sin-free. And again, as long as, now again, if you're a pathological hypocrite where you're abusive at home and foul-mouthed and you have a secret life and your kid finds out about it and you're in church every Sunday.
Oh,
okay. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about the kind of damage that does. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But again, if you're an average Christian who struggles with sin the way most Christians struggle with sin, most Christian kids understand that. My parents were average parents, I think, in a lot of ways. They did some things really well and other things that I wouldn't do as a parent. But I knew that they wanted me to walk with the Lord, and they always had me in church. And that was always extremely important to them. And so I was regularly in fellowship with believers. I was regularly every week, multiple times in the week, under the instruction of the word, and the Lord grabbed a hold of my heart. My parents' imperfections and flaws were in no way threatened to drive me away from the Lord. I knew they were deeply flawed. It's interesting. But that said, parents are going to have regrets, and I know that, and I'll just be kind of gut level honest. When I was a youth minister, and my wife and I, we have 3 kids, and 2 of them were born when I was a youth pastor. One of them was born right after I became a senior pastor of a church, and I was youth pastor in a mega church. Mega Southern Baptist church, and I was always on the go, and I was gone a lot, and I was gone a lot of evenings. And then after that, I was pastor of a brand new church plant. So I was always on the go, and I was gone a lot. And I have a lot of regrets about that because there were ways that affected my kids negatively. And I know it. I mean, we, as adults, we've talked about it together. And there were things that they had to work through and things that they had to process in their thoughts about church. And there are things that I could have done better in those days that I regret. Now, those are regrets. I can't go back and change those things. And what I tell folks when they're in that same kind of situation of, we should have done this better. We should have done less of this and more of that. And now it's too late. Now I can't do anything. What do I do with that? And I say this because this is where I have to rest. I don't give this as a glib answer, but this is where I have to rest. And I've talked with my kids about this, is that in those areas where I've failed, in those areas where I was not present when I should have been present, in those areas where I was preoccupied beyond what I should have been, where it caused tension in my kids' hearts and their thoughts about the church and about the Lord. I have to lean into the resurrection. And to trust that in the end, God is going to make all things right. And in the meantime, to do those things like ask my kids to forgive me, which I've done, which has been really healing and has meant a lot to them. And so to do a lot of those things later now has caused a great deal of fruit in our relationship. It's not too late. I mean, we have a God who redeems. And again, while I can't go back and redo things, the gospel is a reality, where there can be real healing, where there can be repentance and forgiveness, where you can say to your kid, you know what? I would have done that differently. And I bet you that was hard on you. Would you forgive me? Because I think I sinned in that way. Would you forgive me? The gospel can give us really resilient hearts that way. And what I've found is that kids, even after the time where they start to enter their adult years, If they know Jesus at all, there's an impulse to forgive and to be reconciled.
Yeah.
And the Lord gives us that. And so if you are a parent that struggles with regret, talk to your kids about that.
Yeah.
Be honest with them. And there can be a real kind of healing property to that, I think.
Yeah. And it's also, I think, important not to give up hope.
Yes.
One of the texts that I routinely, and I did this just a couple of years ago when I was chatting to not somebody at my church, but another couple, and the issue came up over dinner of a child that was wandering away at that point. I take people to the second thief in the Gospel of Luke. And I make the point, the myth about the second thief on the cross is, it's minimal faith and it just shows that anybody can get in with the best shows. But if you actually analyze what the second thief says, it's pretty profound. I mean, he understands that God is holy.
Right.
He understands that he's a sinner. He understands that the second death is going to be worse than the first death. He understands it. I think we'd be stretching it to say that he has a full, rounded understanding of incarnation and sinlessness. Right. But he certainly understands that Jesus is the Messiah, and he understands that Jesus doesn't deserve to be hanging there as he and his pal do. Yeah. And most amazing of all is he understands the kingdom is going to be inaugurated through death. He says, unlike the first thief and the other. The soldiers and the religious leaders, he says, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He knows Jesus has got to die in order to get into the kingdom. And I always point parents to, when does he learn this stuff?
Exactly.
It's possible. It's possible that God beams it into his brain as he's hanging on the cross. But the text doesn't tell us that. And I think if the text doesn't tell us that, we have to look for more prosaic ways that it got there. And my assumption has always been, he was well taught as a kid.
Right.
His parents taught him well. Yep. Well, then the next question is, all this great teaching he had as a kid, when did it impact his life? When did it become relevant to him? Well, the answer is, even he says he should be hanging on a cross.
Right.
It didn't become relevant until the very last moment.
Yep.
But then that's the only moment that really counted.
Right.
Who knows if his parents were still alive at that point? They may have been long dead. But that teaching he received as a child was a seed that bore amazing fruit. Yep. He is the first man that has God incarnate himself say to him, today you will be with me in paradise. What an amazing privilege for him. And I think that passage, it doesn't guarantee that your child who's wandered away is going to return at the last minute. It doesn't work like that. But it's a reminder to you that despair is not an option, because you do not know the good that will flow. I mean, we don't know the good that flows from the chance encounters we have with people in the supermarket or on the plane. You don't know the good that's going to flow from the fact that you simply and humbly brought your kids up with a knowledge of the gospel. You don't know what fruit that will bear. And in some ways, you have no right to despair if that's in place. So I take parents to that passage and say, it's no guarantee that everything's going to come right, but it's a reminder that you shouldn't judge eternity on the basis of what's immediately in front of your eyes at this particular moment.
Yeah, that's a passage I take them to for the very same reason. And my assumption on that text is what you are hinting at there, that this thief, because there's nothing in the text that suggests that what was revealed to him was done so in a direct miraculous way. I think it's assumed that we will know that, well, at some point somebody taught this guy.
Yeah.
And it was probably in his childhood. Yeah. Because he's been a criminal. It's for some time. By his own acknowledgement, he deserves to be executed in this most horrific of ways. And when he's there and he sees Christ, all of that stuff that he was taught, as he feels the weight of his own sin and as he sees the crucified Christ, he connects things that even some of Jesus's disciples hadn't connected yet. Yeah. And so I that's a text I go to. I go to the text about the persistent widow, who, Jesus gives us this parable of this widow who just keeps asking the judge and keeps going back. And he gives us that parable to help us to pray with persistence.
Yeah.
That there's something about persistent praying, stubborn praying for the right things that is good for us, that honors the Lord. And so, I always tell parents, keep praying for them. And you talked about hope. The weight of what we have in Scripture means that we lean into hope. We understand that apostasy is a real thing. We understand that we do not have a blank check to command the providence and the sovereignty of God. We get that. We understand that. And yet, we also know that family, that the covenant, that teaching a child in their childhood, patterning those things, and prayer.
Yeah.
We know that those things matter in God's economy.
Yeah.
And so therefore, a Christian parent has real, legitimate justification for feeling hopeful. Another thing I tell parents is, and I've stood in the front few rows of our sanctuary on Sunday mornings between services and had these conversations. I'll point around at, some of the people around, and I'll say, that, some of your friends here are former prodigals.
Yeah.
Some of our most fruitful church members are former prodigals. And what's interesting is that some of those conversations I'm having, I'm able to say, you've told me your testimony, how you walked away from the Lord your senior year or whatever, and didn't come back for 10 years, So that the church has lots of former prodigals.
Yeah.
And we're going to pray that your kid is going to be one of those former prodigals. And we have good justification to pray with hopefulness on that.
Yeah. And as always, go to the Psalms in order to find a language that allows you to express your heartache honestly to God. Right. I think the Psalms are beautiful from that perspective. And I would also say, try your best to keep lines of communication open.
Yes.
Now, it can be tricky when your child maybe has professed faith and then walks away, because the Bible also talks about how to treat certain people who've apostatized. And there can be tricky circumstances, but if at all possible, with a good conscience, keep lines of communication open. Again, my principle in a lot of things has always been, if they're not talking to me, who are they talking to?
Right.
And not just with kids, but with colleagues, et cetera, et cetera. Yep. And that's a good, a rule of thumb for keeping talking. And I would say, don't allow the heat of the moment, don't allow your anger and despair to lead you to do something that permanently damages an opportunity for talking to that beloved child at some point in the near future.
Yep. Yeah, I tell folks, do as much as you can to continue to pursue relationship. Now, there are some cases, as you alluded to, where the sin is such that maybe that boundaries have become necessary.
Yeah.
There are certain kinds of sin that people get involved in where the counsel for a parent is to say, listen, you can't let them back in your house.
Yeah.
So that said, that doesn't necessarily mean a cutoff of all communications. Now, again, we can imagine scenarios where a person gets involved in criminal activity, and that's a different discussion in terms of the sorts of boundaries you have to have.
And when there's physical danger involved,
when there's physical danger,
obviously,
absolutely, those kinds of things. And yet, there's this idea of we'll always have a place in our heart for you. Now, if these are, leaving the extreme situations aside, conversations, dropping a lifeline, talking to them. One of the things you need to know, you have to navigate as a parent is this something I need to say right now? And if so, how should I say it in a way that would maximize the potential of them actually hearing it? And sometimes when you've got a child in that situation, you go, you know what? I'm just going to have a regular conversation and I won't bring up X at this point. Yeah. And then other times you do bring it up. Yeah. But just show a lot of wisdom. You don't, if you try to fix your wayward child right now, it probably won't go well.
Yeah.
But if you're patient and if you rest in the Lord and you do these things that we've encouraged you to do, continue to pray, continue to love them, continue to talk to them and listen to them. Then when you do have those conversations that dig in a little deeper, you might be surprised at their willingness. But keep the relationship viable and open, because as you said earlier, if they're not speaking to you, then who are they speaking to? If they're not hearing from you, who are they hearing from? Yeah. And parents have enormous impact in a kid's life, even into their adulthood. Even when there's been pain, a parent has enormous influence, and see how best to leverage that for the soul of your child. And this gets more complicated the older they get, but the influence is still very much there.
Yeah.
And once again, above all, don't lose hope. I sometimes wonder, given the example of the thief on the cross, I wonder how many souls will be with us in glory who came to the Lord in a similar way.
Yeah.
The grace of God is very, very deep. And we know from Jesus's parable of the workers in the vineyard that there will be some who come into the kingdom in the very last minute. Now, that's not an encouragement for us to go and apostatize until we think we're pretty close to death. It's a comfort to those who love people who have wandered away, to continue to pray that they'll be among those workers who come in.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well, we hope that this has been an encouraging time for you. We know that to have a child to walk away from the Lord is particularly difficult and sorrowful for a parent. But remember, we may be hard pressed, but we're not crushed. We may be dismayed, but we're not driven to despair. And for Christian parents, there's always a justifiable reason to be hopeful for your child. Remain persistent, remain prayerful, stay in the Word, and move towards that child in relationship to the best that the circumstances will allow. If you will go to our website, mortificationofspin.org, you can enter to win a copy of a devotional book that I think you will find encouraging. It's called Wayward Children, Finding Peace, Keeping Hope. It's a collection of 31 daily devotionals. And so, each morning or each evening, you can take some time as you pray for your struggling child, to receive some help and encouragement from the scriptures, and help in praying for your child. And so please feel free to go to our website, mortificationofspin.org, register to win a copy of this little book, Wayward Children, Finding Peace, Keeping Hope. And if you're there and would like to make a contribution to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can do that if you would like. But we're so happy that you've been with us. We look forward to being with you next time on Mortification of Spin.
Baby, come back. You can blame it all on me. I was wrong, and I just can't live without you.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.